When Keanu Reeves made his way onto the set of the Steve Harvey Show, the atmosphere was lighthearted. The crowd expected laughs, charm, and maybe a few inside tales from Hollywood. Steve himself was ready to steer the conversation with his usual warmth and wit. But the moment Keanu caught sight of the crucifix hanging around Steve's neck, something shifted, in the tone, in the energy, and maybe even in their purpose. What started as an upbeat interview was on the verge of turning into something much more personal. Because within minutes, Steve Harvey wouldn't be the one asking questions, he'd be the one holding back tears. What Keanu was about to reveal would change everything. And it all started with a single, unexpected line. "Can I tell you something I've never said out loud before?" Round pushpin quick pause. Before we go on, let us know in the comments, where in the world are you watching this from? We love hearing your thoughts. The lights in the studio lowered just a touch as the audience settled in, anticipation humming through the room. Steve's familiar entrance music faded out as he crossed the stage wearing his trademark grin, cue cards in hand, eyes full of warmth. But tonight, from the first few seconds, something felt different. This wasn't just another talk show segment, it felt like something sacred was about to happen. With a voice filled with admiration, Steve introduced Keanu not just as a movie star, but as something far more rare, a human being people connected to, even without ever meeting him. "They say he's the nicest man in Hollywood," Steve said, as applause echoed. "Online, they call him the last good soul in the industry. But me? I say he's the clearest reflection of grace I've ever known." The audience erupted as Keanu stepped out, dressed in his usual down-to-earth style, dark jeans, a simple black shirt, and a plain blazer. No flash. Just Keanu. He gave a small wave, smiled humbly, and nodded briefly, clearly a little uneasy with the attention. As he took his seat beside Steve, the energy in the room shifted once more. Less like a performance. More like a conversation that mattered. There was no rush. No need for showmanship. Just two people being present. Keanu began to speak in a soft, almost cautious tone, as though he didn't want to disturb the stillness of the space. He thanked everyone kindly, then added with a shy chuckle that this kind of warm reception always caught him off guard. "I'm just a guy trying to do what's right," he said. Steve leaned in, smiling. "And that's what makes you different." They began to talk, not just about movies or celebrity gossip, but about compassion, about humanity, about the courage it takes to move through life without hiding behind walls, even when life gives you every reason to build them. Steve brought up Keanu's reputation, the clips of him giving up his subway seat, helping crew members on set, sharing parts of his salary with stunt performers, camera workers, even makeup staff. "All true," Keanu said quietly. But he didn't see those moments as anything extraordinary. "To me," he said softly, "it's just a decent thing to do." His words carried a calm kind of wisdom. Never dramatic. Never self-important. The room hung on every word. "Everyone's dealing with something," he added. "Sometimes the smallest gesture can shift someone's entire day." Steve nodded, clearly moved. There was something deeply humbling about hearing those words from someone who had every reason to hide behind fame and status, and yet here he was, honest and open. The conversation moved into deeper territory. Not about fame. Not about film. But about life, raw, unfiltered, and real. Keanu sat with a kind of stillness that pulled the room in. There was no performance in his tone, only presence. Steve leaned forward, asking gently, "How do you stay grounded in a world that keeps putting you on a pedestal?" Keanu smiled faintly. "I think I've always felt like none of this is guaranteed," he said. "You learn that when life shakes you." Steve's eyes softened. "What do you mean?" Keanu hesitated, not because he didn't know what to say, but because some truths require silence before they're spoken. "I've lost a lot," he said. "And when you lose the people you love, not just to death, but to time, to change, you realize something: none of this makes you better than anyone else." The audience sat motionless. Every breath seemed to pause. Keanu's eyes drifted slightly, maybe toward a memory, maybe toward something he hadn't shared in years. "I moved around a lot as a kid," he continued. Born in Lebanon, raised in Canada. My father left when I was young. My sister, she fought leukemia. I lost someone I loved deeply. I lost a child. And I'm still here. He paused, letting the weight of those words breathe. Every single day, you make a choice, he said. You can let pain harden you. Or you can let it soften you, shape you. The studio was utterly silent. Even the cameras seemed to lean in. There was no script here. No direction. Just truth. Steve didn't respond right away. He simply reached up and gently touched the crucifix around his neck, his fingers resting there, not for the audience, but for himself. You speak about silence like it's something you know well, Steve finally said. Keanu nodded. I do, he replied. Silence has been my companion for a long time. But sometimes in silence, I hear the clearest things. Steve leaned back slightly, voice quieter now. Do you ever hear God in that silence? For the first time during the interview, Keanu paused. Really paused. Then he looked Steve in the eyes and answered, yes. I believe in something bigger. I've questioned it. I've walked away from it. I've felt alone. But even in the darkest places, I felt something, a presence. A kind of peace. Not always loud. Not always comforting. But always there. Steve's hand gently closed around the cross on his chest. That's faith, he said quietly. Even if it doesn't have a name. Even if it's just a feeling. Keanu glanced at the crucifix now, his eyes shifting, softening. He leaned forward slightly, as if the next words were sitting just at the edge of his breath. Steve, he said. His voice lowered. It carried something else now, something sacred. Can I tell you something I've never told anyone before? Steve didn't speak. He just nodded. Keanu inhaled slowly. A deep, intentional breath. There was a night, he began, a few years ago. I was in a very dark place. I couldn't eat. Couldn't sleep. I didn't even know if I wanted to keep going. Everything felt hollow. The room froze. I was just scrolling through my phone, he continued, trying to feel something. Anything. And then I saw a video. It was you. Steve blinked. You were talking about purpose. About faith. About how God doesn't waste pain. Keanu looked up, voice trembling just slightly. But it wasn't just what you said. It was how you said it. Like you meant it. Like you'd lived it. You were wearing this crucifix, this exact one. He gestured towards Steve's chest. And I remember thinking, this man believes in something bigger. Maybe I can too. Steve's hand gripped the cross a little tighter. Keanu's voice dropped to a whisper. I watched that video 3 times, he said. And the next morning, for the first time in weeks, I got out of bed. He sat back, the memory settling into the silence. I've never told anyone that, Keanu said, but your words, they've stayed with me ever since. Steve didn't respond immediately. His face was still. His eyes full. When he finally spoke, his voice cracked. I was just speaking from the heart, he said. I had no idea it would reach anyone like that. Keanu gently interrupted him. But that's the point, he said. You weren't trying to inspire. You weren't trying to save anyone. You were just being real. And that's what saved me. Steve's eyes welled up. A tear slid down, catching the light. And that crucifix you wear, Keanu continued, his voice now heavy with meaning, it's more than a symbol. It's a signal. A sign. You think you're just a comedian who believes in something, but Steve, I think you're something more. Steve looked at him, confused but open. You're a minister in disguise, Keanu said. And I have something else to share with you, something that might shift your life, the way you shifted mine. The entire studio went quiet. Not a whisper. Not a cough. Even the background hum of the cameras seemed to vanish. Steve, hand still on the cross, whispered one word. "I'm listening." What followed wasn't just a pause for dramatic effect, it was the kind of silence that feels sacred, like the space before a prayer is spoken. Keanu leaned back slightly, adjusted his seat, then took another breath, deeper this time, like a man preparing to open a door long kept closed. He didn't blink. His gaze stayed locked on Steve. "There was a time in my life," he began, "when I couldn't find a reason to keep going." Steve didn't move, but you could feel the weight shift in him, like his soul had leaned forward. "I had lost people," Keanu continued. "Not just to death. To time. To pain. One after the other." His voice was calm, but every word felt like it echoed inside a chamber built of buried grief. "My daughter was stillborn," he said gently. "And not long after, I lost Jennifer, the person who felt most like home." He looked down at his hands. "I don't even think I cried at first. Grief, it's not always loud. Sometimes it's so quiet, you forget you're even alive." People in the audience leaned forward. Some sat back, arms folded like they were hugging themselves. "I kept working," Keanu said. "I kept doing interviews, kept playing roles, because it's easier to disappear behind a character than to be yourself when your true self feels shattered." Steve's fingers returned to the crucifix. "Not for drama. Just instinct." "But over time," Keanu said, "even all that noise couldn't drown out the silence inside me." Then he added, "And one night, that silence almost won." Steve tilted his head, eyes scanning Keanu's face, bracing for what came next. "It was late," Keanu said softly. "I hadn't slept in days. I wasn't eating. I didn't want to talk. I didn't want to be. I just sat in the dark. 4 hours." He paused. Not for effect, but because there were no words for that kind of stillness. No prayers. No thoughts. Just the thought after all thoughts, that maybe this was it. The air grew heavier in the room. "And then," Keanu said, voice shifting almost imperceptibly, "I picked up my phone. Just scrolling. Not for anything. Just to stop the nothing." He looked at Steve, his tone suddenly delicate. "And that's when I saw it." Steve blinked again, caught mid-memory. "You were on stage," Keanu said. "Talking about storms. About how God doesn't waste pain. About how the thing that's breaking you might be the thing that's opening you." Steve nodded slowly, beginning to remember the moment. "I don't know why I stopped scrolling," Keanu said, "but I watched the whole thing. And then I watched it again." His voice cracked, just a little. "You said, if you're still breathing, it means God's not done with you yet." A few audience members were now visibly emotional. "And that hit me different," Keanu whispered. "It didn't feel like a quote. It felt like someone finally saw me. Not the actor. Not the celebrity. Just the man in the dark." Steve let out a soft exhale. His hand fully covered the cross now. Keanu leaned forward, elbows on his knees, voice low. "And I need you to know, Steve, that night, I stood up." Keanu let that line sit in the space between them. Not rushed. Not dressed up. Just true. "I didn't stand because I was healed," he said. "Not because I suddenly had hope or answers. But because for the first time in a long time, I felt seen. And that was enough to make me move." Steve placed his hand over his chest again, this time with emotion he wasn't trying to hide. His eyes were moist, his lips trembling slightly. Keanu looked at him with a mixture of reverence and gratitude. "I never planned to share this story," he said. "But sitting here, with you, I realized, I had to." Steve nodded slowly, his voice thick. "Man, I don't even know what to say." "You don't have to," Keanu replied gently. "You already did. Years ago." He motioned toward the cross hanging around Steve's neck. "That right there, that's what caught my attention first. Before your words. Before your message. That symbol, in that moment, it was like a lighthouse. Steve's gaze dropped to the crucifix again. His hand tightened instinctively. "I kept replaying that message over the next few days," Keanu said. "Not because it cured me, but because it reminded me healing doesn't always require answers. Sometimes, it just needs hope." The studio was still. Some audience members wiped their eyes. Others just stared quietly, absorbing the moment. Steve leaned back in his chair, swallowing hard. "You think you're just talking," Keanu said. "You think you're just entertaining people, or surviving another show. But that night, you weren't just doing that. You were lifting someone who didn't even want to stand." Steve closed his eyes for a beat, absorbing it all. "I had to tell you," Keanu added. "Because the world knows you as a host. A comedian. A motivator. But I don't think that's all you are." Steve looked back at him, eyes full of stunned awareness. "I think," Keanu said slowly, "you're a minister in disguise." A silence followed, long and deep. Steve's eyes watered again. He didn't shake his head to reject the words. He just sat there, like someone processing something that hit deeper than logic. "You ever wonder," Keanu asked gently, "why people are drawn to you?" "All the time," Steve admitted. Keanu smiled faintly. "It's not just your voice they hear. It's your spirit they feel. You carry something sacred." Steve gave a short, broken laugh. "I'm just trying to make it, man. Like everybody else. That's what makes it real," Keanu said. "You're not pretending to be perfect. You're not trying to be anything more than who you are. And because of that, you reach people you'll never even meet." He turned slightly, motioning toward the audience. "People in this room. People watching through a screen. People sitting in silence, like I was." Then he looked back at Steve. "And I know it's not easy, carrying that kind of weight. Not knowing if it matters. Not knowing who's listening." Steve nodded slowly, visibly emotional. "But I'm here to tell you," Keanu said, "it does." And just when it felt like the moment had reached its emotional limit, Keanu's expression shifted, just slightly, but clearly. More serious now. More focused. He leaned in. His voice dropped. "Steve," he said. "The way you wear that crucifix, it's not just an accessory. It's a signal. A message." Then, with full intent, he added, "And tonight, I need to tell you something that could change your life, the way you changed mine." Steve looked up, startled. The audience leaned in. Everyone sensed it, something sacred was about to be said. "What do you mean?" Steve asked softly. Keanu's eyes didn't move. "I've been holding on to these words for years," he said. "They came from you. And tonight, I need to say them back to you." Steve sat motionless. His breath uneven. Keanu gave a single nod. His tone calm, but purposeful. "Because I think you may have forgotten how powerful your own words really are." The air in the studio thickened, not with tension, but with reverence. Steve Harvey, usually the master of the moment, sat frozen, his eyes fixed on Keanu Reeves, the man who had come here to return something sacred. Keanu sat upright, breathing in slowly, as though preparing to speak from a place far beyond memory. "I remember the lighting in that video," he said. "It wasn't perfect. A little grainy. You were on stage, holding a mic in one hand, and your other hand was right over your heart. Over that cross." Steve nodded slowly, already feeling it. "You were talking about purpose," Keanu continued. "But not in a polished, rehearsed way. You were fighting through your own story as you said it. And I remember it, word for word." He locked eyes with Steve. "You said, pain has a language. And when someone who's truly lived through something speaks it, it cuts through the noise." Steve's lips parted slightly. His hand moved back to the cross. "And then you said something else," Keanu added, voice gentle but anchored. "God doesn't always call the qualified. He qualifies the called." The words hit Steve like a wave. His hand clenched the crucifix tightly. You said that God uses ordinary people to do extraordinary things, Keanu continued. That even when you think you're just telling jokes, just paying the bills, just trying to survive the day, God might be using all of it to change someone's life. Steve leaned forward, elbows on his knees, the old memory returning clearer with every word. That clip, Keanu said, the one you recorded after a show, when you hit a low point and spoke straight from your soul, no notes, no filter, that clip changed me. He looked down for a beat, then back up, voice softening. It wasn't just what you said. It was how you said it. You believed it. And that belief, it lit something in me. His hand rested over his heart now. I had lost my sense of direction. The grief. The silence. It buried my compass. But those words, and the way you carried them, they reminded me that even in my lowest moment, I wasn't invisible. He looked up again, eyes glassy but clear. You were a stranger to me, he said. But in that moment, you became a beacon. Steve let out a long breath. The kind that escapes from the chest when your soul recognizes truth. Keanu smiled gently. And the thing about beacons is, they don't always know who's watching. They just shine. There was a long pause. Not empty. Not awkward. Just full of everything that had been said, and everything that hadn't. Steve finally spoke, voice low and vulnerable. You know, sometimes I wonder if I've really done enough. If all this, the comedy, the hosting, the speaking, if it actually means anything. Keanu leaned forward slightly, voice steady. It does. I'm living proof. Steve shook his head, overwhelmed. I was just trying to survive, man, he said, barely above a whisper. I wasn't trying to save anyone. Keanu didn't miss a beat. And that, he said, is exactly why you did. A hush swept through the crowd. A few people wiped their eyes. Others sat still, visibly moved. Steve looked out at the audience for a moment, then turned back to Keanu. You said that video changed something in you, Steve said. What was it? Keanu took a second before replying. Hope, he said. That maybe the silence I was living in wasn't the end of my story. That maybe, just maybe, God still had something left for me to do. He looked Steve directly in the eye. And seeing that cross on your chest while you spoke about divine purpose, it wasn't a coincidence. It was confirmation. A quiet sign that light finds a way, even through a screen. Steve nodded slowly, visibly shaken but deeply present. You reminded me, Keanu said softly, that I wasn't forgotten. That my story wasn't over. He paused again, letting the moment breathe. And I remember exactly what you said, Steve. Every word. I've carried it for years. And tonight, I need to say it back to you. Because maybe, just maybe, you've forgotten how powerful it really is. Steve looked at Keanu, a question silently forming in his eyes, but he didn't ask it aloud. Keanu took a deep breath. His gaze never left Steve's. Sometimes, he began, you're not the one being saved, you're the one doing the saving, and you don't even realize it. Steve's lips trembled slightly. His hands folded, almost in prayer, resting just below his chin. You think you're just speaking, Keanu continued. But you're actually testifying. He leaned back slightly, giving the moment room to land. Steve covered his face with his hands for a second, then looked up, his eyes shining. You remembered all that? He asked, voice full of disbelief. I had to, Keanu said softly. Because I wasn't just listening. I was being lifted. Steve sat back in his chair, hands clasped, like a man trying to hold something sacred together. The room didn't feel like a studio anymore. It felt like something spiritual, like healing was taking place right there under the lights. Keanu's voice came again, quieter now. And maybe you don't hear this enough, Steve. But you matter. He paused, then added. Not because of what you do, but because of who you are. Steve looked down, overwhelmed. His chest rose and fell with slow, emotional breaths. You carried faith, Keanu said, into places where people had none left, including me. Steve couldn't respond right away. His voice had gone. Only his heart spoke now, visible in every breath, every blink. And then Keanu said something else. Soft. Almost fragile. Today, I have something to say to you, something that may change your life, the same way you changed mine. Steve looked up slowly, and the entire room held its breath. For a long moment, Steve Harvey didn't speak. He just absorbed. Every word. Every truth. Every thank you unspoken for years. Then Keanu leaned forward again. Not with performance. With purpose. His voice carried no act. Only truth. Steve, he said, there's something I've held inside for a long time. A sentence I've never said out loud, until now. Steve nodded once, waiting, not with curiosity, but with reverence. Go ahead, he said quietly. Keanu exhaled gently, like the moment itself needed clearing. God uses his chosen ones, he began, even when they think they're just telling jokes. Steve blinked, frozen in place. You thought you were just trying to bring people laughter, Keanu said. Just making it through your own pain. But Steve, you were saving lives. Another tear escaped down Steve's cheek, this one softer. Deeper. Full of understanding. Keanu nodded slowly, confirming the weight of the words. You saved mine, he said. And for a moment, the entire room held still. No movement. No sound. Even the cameras seemed to lower their gaze. Steve let out a breath, part laugh, part sob, part holy awe. I was just trying to make it, man, he said, shaking his head. Just trying to get through like everybody else. Keanu's voice remained steady. Exactly. That's what made it holy. The line lingered like incense. Heavy. Lingering. Sacred. Then, something unexpected happened. Steve stood up. His body trembled, not from fear, but from something deeper. Something sacred. He didn't speak. He just placed his hand over his cross again, eyes fixed on Keanu. Keanu stood too. Now they faced each other, not host and guest, not comedian and actor, but man to man. Soul to soul. The studio held its breath. Time stopped. Steve looked at Keanu and asked the question that didn't come from doubt, it came from deep, aching wonder. Why me? He asked softly. And Keanu, without hesitation, replied. I'll tell you. The camera slowly zoomed in. The audience didn't move. No one dared to interrupt what was happening on that stage. Steve's voice echoed in the quiet. Why me, man? Out of everybody, why would God choose me? Keanu took a single step forward, closing the space between them. His eyes were steady. His presence calm. And he said it again. I'll tell you. The silence wasn't empty, it was sacred. You could feel it in the room. Some people wiped tears. Some gripped the hands of the person beside them. No one reached for a phone. No one blinked. Keanu spoke softly, but every word was iron-wrapped in velvet. Because God chooses the unlikely, he said. He chooses the ones no one expects, the ones who've been overlooked, who've bled quietly behind the curtain. Steve didn't move. His eyes were brimming again, not just with tears, but with recognition. Keanu stepped in even closer, his voice lower now. He picks people who felt pain, because they know how to speak to the pain in others. Steve's breath caught. The truth of those words sat heavy in his chest. You're not the loudest, Keanu continued. You're not the most polished. You didn't go to seminary. You didn't memorize scripture. But God saw your scars, and trusted you with a microphone anyway. Steve's voice cracked. But, why me? He asked again. This time his soul was in it. Why would he use someone like me? Keanu didn't rush. He stood still, face to face with a man unraveling and awakening at the same time. I'll tell you, he said. The moment was cinematic, but it didn't feel like a show. It felt like church. Without walls. Without robes. Without rehearsals. Just two men and the truth. Keanu finally spoke again. "Because your voice doesn't sound like a preacher's," he said. "It sounds like a man who's been through it. Who's lost. Who's struggled. Who's wept in the dark." Steve's head dropped. He wiped his face with the back of his hand, overwhelmed. There was no applause. No music swell. Just presence. Then Steve lifted his head, eyes focused now, but burning with a question. "Do you really believe," he asked, "that we can still have faith in a world like this?" The question didn't just hang in the air. It settled there, like dust in sunlight. Keanu looked at him, not surprised, not thrown. Instead, he looked like a man ready to answer something that had already lived inside him for a long, long time. Steve had asked, "Do you really believe we can still have faith in a world like this?" Keanu didn't answer immediately. He let the silence do its work. Then, slowly, clearly, and without a shadow of doubt, he spoke. "I believe faith is the only thing that's not pretending." Steve tilted his head slightly, listening with everything he had. "In Hollywood," Keanu said, "we live off scripts. Everything's rehearsed. Pain is staged. Joy is faked. Everything is edited and performed." He paused. "But faith has no director. No retakes. It demands truth. It demands surrender." His voice dropped lower, not to whisper, but to honor the gravity of what he was saying. "Faith isn't glamorous. It doesn't win awards. It's not invited to the after party. But it saves people, quietly, deeply, forever." Steve nodded slowly, his throat tight, his hand still over his heart. "Hollywood teaches you how to act," Keanu said. "But faith teaches you how to live." The audience didn't move, not even to breathe. The energy in the room had shifted again, into something ancient. "Faith is the only road," Keanu said, "with no spotlight, no applause. Just you and God." Steve didn't speak. He just placed his hand over his chest and nodded slowly, overwhelmed. "I didn't grow up with religion," Keanu admitted. "But I've come to believe that faith is real, not because someone preached it to me, but because it met me in the silence." His eyes were glistening now. "It met me when the lights were off. When the world was gone. When there was no one else around." He looked at Steve. "And it met me, through you." Steve's face crumbled. Not in pain, in knowing. Not in shame, in surrender. Keanu stood slowly, as if the words inside him demanded more than sitting could contain. After a heartbeat, Steve rose with him. They looked at one another, two men, shaped by pain, standing in quiet agreement beneath the glow of studio lights that no longer felt artificial. There was no applause. No rush. No break for commercial. Just reverence. Keanu reached out, and Steve stepped forward, without hesitation. They embraced. Not as host and guest. Not as celebrity and star. But as brothers. The audience began to rise, one by one. No clapping. No noise. Just standing, as if they, too, recognized something sacred had arrived. Steve slowly turned to the crowd, voice breaking but full of spirit. "I've had a lot of moments on this stage," he said. "But this right here is the greatest gift I've ever been given." He paused, tears rolling, and whispered, "Let's pray." And in that studio, in front of millions watching, two men who had every reason to pretend, dropped the act. And became instruments of healing. For a moment, the world believed again. Silence wrapped the space like a blanket. Steve and Keanu slowly returned to their seats, but the weight of the moment sat with them. It wasn't over. Keanu leaned forward, eyes gentler now, like he had one last offering. "Steve," he said quietly, "there's one more thing I need to tell you. A line you once said, that I've carried for years." Steve looked at him, nodding. His eyes begged for it. Keanu inhaled deeply. You once said, God doesn't always use the mighty or the perfect. Sometimes he picks the broken, the ones no one expects. Because they know how to reach the hearts the strong can't. Steve blinked slowly, the words washing over him like rain on dry ground. You don't need a pulpit to preach, Keanu continued. You don't need a robe to be called. You don't need a church to carry the word. His voice never shook. It grew stronger, not louder, but deeper. Sometimes, he said, your pain is your ministry. And sometimes, your comedy is just the disguise God uses to send people hope. Steve opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. He was undone. Completely. Then Keanu looked at him, not with admiration, but with clarity. The kind of gaze someone has when they aren't delivering a compliment, they're delivering revelation. You thought you were just making people laugh, Keanu said. But you were reaching hearts. Saving lives. Carrying light. And then, one final line, the one that broke Steve wide open. You're a minister, Steve. You just happen to wear a suit instead of a collar. Steve's head dropped. One hand covered his face. The other gripped the cross at his chest. And the tears came. Not hidden. Not held back. Pure. Honest. Free. The audience didn't move. They didn't cheer. They witnessed. Keanu's voice returned, softer now, as if walking barefoot through holy ground. And the way you wear that crucifix, he said. It's not just jewelry. It's a signal. And tonight, I think it's pointing towards something much bigger than either of us. Steve looked up, his face soaked in tears, but his expression somehow lighter, like something invisible had been lifted. Keanu inhaled slowly, as though bracing himself. Because tonight, he said, I have something else to share with you, something that may shift your life the way you shifted mine. Steve's eyes widened, not in fear, but in sacred anticipation. Keanu leaned in, voice steady but intimate. Like you changed mine. Steve wiped his face slowly, his hand trembling just slightly as it lowered from his eyes. The tears hadn't fully stopped, but now, they mingled with something else. Stillness. Peace. A quiet awe. Keanu sat across from him, composed, waiting, like a man holding a message too sacred to rush. And then, with a slow breath, he said it. Steve, there's something I need to tell you. A sentence that's lived inside me for years. I've never said it aloud, until now. Steve nodded slowly. His voice barely a whisper. Go ahead. Keanu leaned forward again. His tone stripped of all performance, grounded entirely in truth. God uses his chosen ones, he began, even when they think they're just telling jokes. Steve blinked, his eyes didn't leave Keanu, but he looked stunned. You thought you were just entertaining people, Keanu said gently. Just surviving. Just making folks smile. Then he paused. But Steve, you were saving lives. Another tear rolled down Steve's cheek, this one different. This one didn't carry pain. It carried understanding. Keanu nodded once, as if to say yes, this is real. You saved mine, he said again, softly, steadily, without needing a reaction. And for one long, sacred beat, the entire room fell completely silent. Even the cameras seemed to stand still, like they were bowing. Steve leaned back in his seat, exhaling with a sound somewhere between a sob and a sigh. I was just trying to get through, he said. Trying to get past my own pain. Like everybody else. Keanu nodded. Exactly. Then he said something that struck the deepest chord yet. That's what made it holy. The words didn't just echo in the studio, they landed in hearts. Then something unexpected happened. Something no one could have rehearsed. Steve stood up again. This time, not because he was overwhelmed, but because something inside him had changed. He didn't speak. He simply touched the crucifix once more and looked at Keanu, not with questions, but with belief. Keanu stood with him. They were face to face again, only this time, something had shifted between them. The air was different. Steve's voice cracked the quiet. Why me? He wasn't asking out of fear anymore. It came from awe. From surrender. From humility. Why would God choose me? And Keanu, still unsure, said, I'll tell you. He didn't rush. He let the silence speak for a few seconds, as if inviting heaven itself into the conversation. Then, with gentleness, but without hesitation, Keanu answered, because God chooses the unlikely. He looked into Steve's eyes. He picks the ones who've been forgotten. The ones who've wept behind closed doors. The ones who never expected to be used, and that's exactly why they're perfect for the job. Steve's lips quivered. Keanu stepped a little closer. You're not the loudest, he said. You're not the cleanest. You're not the one who memorized all the right words. Then, with reverence, but God saw your scars. And trusted you with a mic anyway. Steve's eyes filled again. But this time, the tears weren't breaking him. They were freeing him. Steve stood frozen, as if the words had opened something he didn't even know was locked. His voice came soft, fragile. I've thought about quitting before. He looked out toward the empty space beyond the stage lights. Walking away from all of it, the spotlight, the shows, the speaking. Keanu nodded slowly, not surprised. I have too, he said. More than once. They both sat down again. Not because the moment was over, but because it had deepened. Settled. Rooted. Steve leaned forward, elbows on his knees, voice lower now, almost confessional. I've asked God so many times, what do you want from me? His voice shook slightly. I feel like I'm not good enough to talk about faith. Not clean enough. Not consistent enough. Keanu nodded again. His response was calm, certain. That's exactly why he picked you. Steve looked up. Because your voice doesn't sound like a preacher's, Keanu said. It sounds like someone who's lived it. Someone who knows what it feels like to lose. To struggle. To cry in the dark. The studio didn't need music. Didn't need editing. The silence itself was holy. Steve looked at Keanu again. This time, with something more in his gaze, something sharp. A final question. Do you really believe, he asked, we can still have faith, in a world like this? The room held its breath. Keanu didn't flinch. He looked back with eyes clear as water, full of stillness, and something deeper. Yes, he said. Because faith is the only thing that isn't pretending. Steve closed his eyes for a moment. Keanu continued. In this world, everything is manufactured. Edited. Filtered. We fake joy. We rehearse pain. He leaned in. But faith? It has no director. It has no script. It requires you to be real. To be raw. To let go. He paused. Faith doesn't get standing ovations. It doesn't trend. But it saves people, quietly, and forever. Steve nodded, lips pressed tight, overwhelmed by the truth. Keanu's voice lowered. And the thing is, it met me. He paused. Not in a church. Not during a movie. Not at an award show. He motioned toward Steve. It met me, through you. Steve let out a long, slow exhale. Not the host. Not the comedian. Not the man on stage, Keanu continued. But the broken, still standing man with a cross on his chest, who had the courage to speak life into a stranger through a screen. And then Keanu stood one last time. Steve joined him. They looked at each other, not just men now, but vessels. I remember every word you spoke in that clip, Keanu said. And tonight, I'm returning those words to you. Not as a reminder. As a mirror. Steve didn't move. And Keanu began. God doesn't always use the mighty. Or the perfect. Sometimes, he uses the ones no one expected. Steve blinked, tears falling again. Because those people, Keanu continued, know how to touch hearts the strong can't. A stillness fell over the audience that could only be described as sacred. You don't need a pulpit to preach. You don't need a title to testify. You don't need a church to be called. Steve's hands clutched the arms of his chair now, like anchoring to something real. Keanu stepped in. You thought you were just surviving. But you were ministering. You thought you were just making people laugh, but you were giving them hope. Then, the final line. The one no one would ever forget. You're a minister, Steve. You just wear a suit instead of a collar. Steve collapsed into Keanu's arms. No stage. No show. Just a sacred moment. The studio stayed silent. Not in discomfort, but in reverence. When Steve pulled back, face soaked, voice hoarse, he turned to the audience, lifted his head and said, "Let's pray." And for the first time in a long time, maybe even ever, a television moment turned into church. And two men reminded the world. Faith isn't found in perfection. It's found in presence. And sometimes, the loudest message comes from the quietest voice.